June 7th, 1944. The French coast, Omaha Sector. Time had stopped somewhere between eternity and the next explosion. Inside the concrete monster known to its German engineers as Widerstandsnest 62, a half-light reigned, thick and viscous like cooling blood. The air was heavy, stale, saturated with the smells of gunpowder, hot metal, old sweat, and that faint, sweetish odor of death that seeps into memory itself. 5 men, all that remained of the assault group, had become ghosts locked in a tomb they had conquered for themselves. Sergeant Elias Thorne stood at the narrow embrasure, his silhouette carved out of the darkness by the merciless, almost white light pouring in from the beach. His eyes, inflamed from sleeplessness and tension, gazed upon the panorama of hell he had helped create. The beach below, which yesterday had been a goal, a dream, a point on a map, was now a graveyard of machines and men. Mangled landing craft like beached whales, smoldering Sherman tanks, their barrels raised to the sky as if in silent prayer. And the bodies. Hundreds of bodies scattered across the wet sand like broken toys forgotten by a cruel child. The tide's waves lapped at them lazily, carrying away garrison caps, helmets, and unsent letters into the sea. Yesterday they were soldiers. Today they were part of the landscape. Thorne felt nothing. Not the triumph of capturing this pillbox, nor the horror of the sight. Inside him was only the scorched emptiness, filled with a ringing in his ears and the monotonous, dry crackle of the German MG-42 machine gun, which was now their main and only argument. The machine gun had been silent for an hour. Its barrel was cooling, making soft clicking sounds. Near it, hunched on ammunition crates, sat Corporal Miller, a man whose cynical smirk had been wiped away over the last 24 hours, leaving only a gray mask of exhaustion on his face. He was methodically cleaning his M1 carbine, his movements slow, almost somnambulistic. In the corner, barely visible in the shadows, the medic everyone just called Doc Peterson was trying to bandage Private Kid Davis, the 19-year-old boy from Ohio, who just 2 days ago was telling everyone about his girlfriend and his plans for life after the war, was now moaning softly, clutching Doc's hand, his trouser legs soaked with dark, almost black blood. The 5th was Private Pops Callahan, an old soldier who had been through the First World War. He wasn't sitting. He stood with his back against the cold concrete wall, just staring into space. His face, like a cracked map of old roads, expressed nothing. He had seen too much to be surprised by this. They were trapped, locked inside their greatest prize. They had captured the pillbox, the citadel that had rained lead down upon them. But during the assault, an explosion had collapsed the only exit, turning the steel door into a heap of twisted metal. They were in a concrete mousetrap cut off from their own, who was still dying down there on that godforsaken beach. They were the target. To their own, they were a captured position. To the Germans, who were already beginning to recover on the hills behind them, they were a splinter that needed to be pulled out, at any cost. Thorne shifted his gaze from the beach to his men, at Miller, whose hands trembled with fatigue, at Doc, who was whispering to the kid not to lose consciousness, at Pops, who seemed to have turned into a statue. He was their leader. He had brought them here, and he had to get them out. But how? How could they escape the tomb that had become their only sanctuary? He didn't have the answer yet. He only knew one thing. The war hadn't ended with the capture of the pillbox. For the 5 of them, it was just beginning. And this was a completely different war. A war not for flags and territories, but for one more sip of water, for one more hour of silence, for one more breath. But to understand how these 5 Rangers, the pride and glory of the American Army, had been turned into cornered animals locked in the enemy's lair, we must go back 36 hours to the cold, salty waters of the English Channel, when they still believed in the plan, in victory, and in the idea that tomorrow would come for them. Just 2 days before their world shrank to the size of a concrete box, they were part of a vast, inexorable invasion machine. The landing ship Empire Anvil cut through the leaden waves of the English Channel, and on its decks, crammed with equipment and men, the atmosphere was one of tense, almost feverish anticipation. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, sea salt, and cheap tobacco. The soldiers, hundreds of young faces, tried to hide their fear behind bravado, jokes, and rituals meant to bring good luck. They cleaned their weapons to a mirror shine, checked their ammunition over and over, and wrote last awkward letters home in which there was not a single word about what awaited them. Sergeant Elias Thorne stood at the rail, staring at the gray shroud that hid the French coast. He did not partake in the general excitement. At 32, he was already an old man by the standards of this war. a veteran of the campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. He had seen how war grinds up boys like these, full of hope and confidence in their own immortality. He had no illusions. He knew that any plan, even the most brilliant one, crumbles to dust upon first contact with reality. His job wasn't to believe in the plan, but to make his men survive when everything went wrong, and it would definitely go wrong. Beside him stood Corporal Miller, a lean, wiry kid from Brooklyn whose eyes looked at the world with an eternal, unquenchable cynicism. "So, Sergeant," he drawled, letting out a smoke ring, "you believe in this little walk on the beach?" "They say the Air Force and the Navy will turn that place into a moonscape. All we'll have to do is walk in and raise the flag." Thorne didn't turn his head. "I believe the Germans have machine guns, Miller, and they know how to shoot them. Everything else is propaganda for the papers." Miller smirked. He respected Thorne for exactly that, for the absence of false heroism. At the other end of the deck, young Private Davis, whom everyone called Kid, was showing his comrades a photograph of his girlfriend. She smiled from the worn picture, and that smile was from another, distant, almost unreal world. "When I get back, we'll get married right away," he said haltingly, blushing. "We'll have our own house, kids." Pops Callahan, sitting nearby on an ammo crate, patted him on the shoulder. "She's a good girl, son. Hold on to that thought. Sometimes thoughts like that are the only thing that gets you through." Callahan rarely spoke, but his words always carried weight. He was a living reminder that war was not an adventure, but dirty hard work. In the medical bay, Corporal Peterson, or just Doc, was checking his bags for the 100th time. Morphine, sulfa powder, bandages, tourniquets. He was a man of science, a man of order. To him, war was a series of traumas to be classified and treated. He hated the chaos of battle, but it was there that his methodical mind and steady hands were needed most. In the evening, when the sky turned a dark violet, the order was read to them. They learned their code name, Omaha. It sounded homely, almost cozy. The chaplain read a prayer, and for a few moments, a silence fell over the ship, broken only by the creaking of the rigging and the splash of the waves. In that silence, each man was lost in his own thoughts. Thorne remembered the face of his commanding officer, who had died in Sicily because of his, Thorne's, mistake. Miller thought about how sick he was of all of this. Kid Davis reread the letter from his girlfriend again and again. Pops Callahan just closed his eyes, his face impassive. And Doc Peterson mentally rehearsed the procedure for arterial bleeding. They did not yet know that the word Omaha would become synonymous with hell for them. They did not yet know that most of those standing with them on that deck had only a few hours left to live. That last night before the landing, Sergeant Thorne looked at the sleeping soldiers of his platoon for a long time. He saw their faces, young, serene in their sleep, and felt a heavy, leaden responsibility. He was their shepherd, who had to lead his flock through the valley of the shadow of death. He didn't know how many he could save. He only prayed that he would have the strength not to break himself. At 4 a.m, the roar of a siren woke them. The last breakfast began. No one could eat. A lump was stuck in their throats. They put on their gear, checked their weapons, their faces gray in the dim light of the lamps. Then they began to descend into the Higgins boats bobbing on the dark, restless waves. A fine, cold rain was drizzling. The French coast was still invisible, but its presence was felt physically. It was there, ahead, and it was waiting. Thorne was the last to jump into his boat. He looked over his men. 29 men. His men. He nodded to the coxswain. The engine roared, and the boat, bouncing on the waves, rushed into the pre-dawn gloom. At that moment, when the steel ramp of their landing craft had not yet touched the water, they had no idea that the sound they would hear in a few minutes would not be the patter of bullets on metal, but a death knell for their world, their hopes, and their lives. The roar of the engines mixed with a distant growing rumble. It was the sound of the naval artillery that was supposed to turn the German fortifications to dust. But through the thick curtain of fog and smoke, almost nothing was visible. The bombers, which were supposed to carpet bomb the beach, had dropped their payloads further inland due to poor visibility, causing almost no damage to the German pillboxes. The soldiers in the boat sat huddled together, trying to shield themselves from the icy spray and the piercing wind. They were sick from the rocking and from fear. Sergeant Thorne stood by the ramp, peering into the gray mist. He saw flashes on the shore, too many flashes. "Get ready!" His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the engine's roar. And in that moment all hell broke loose. The boat was shaken so violently that men tumbled over one another. Very close, about 50 meters, roughly 55 yards away, A column of water and fire shot into the sky, a direct hit on the neighboring craft. The screams from there were cut off almost instantly. All that was left was floating debris and dark stains on the water. And then the machine guns opened up from the shore. It was a sound that could not be mistaken for anything else. The dry, furious, monotonous chatter of the MG-42, which the soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw or the bone cutter. It didn't just shoot. It tore the air apart, spitting out up to 1,500 rounds a minute. Bullets hammered against the steel ramp, striking off showers of sparks. The sound was deafening, like giant hailstones pounding on a tin roof. Thorne realized they had walked into a trap. They were being landed directly in front of a well-sighted, undamaged defense node. "Hold on! Almost there!" he yelled, though he himself knew it was pointless. The boat scraped its bottom on the sand and stopped. "Ramp down!" the coxswain commanded. And in that moment, time slowed, stretching into infinity. The steel ramp fell into the water with a crash, and through the opening poured not only the murky surf, but a squall of lead. The first two soldiers standing at the exit were simply torn to pieces, their bodies jerking like puppets before collapsing into the water, staining it crimson. "Go! Go! Move it!" Thorne roared, pushing the men, who were paralyzed with terror, outside. There was no time to think. There was only one rule: move or die. He jumped into the ice-cold water, which came up to his waist. Bullets churned the water around him into foam, whistling past his ears. He saw his men fall. One clutched his throat as blood gushed from it like a fountain. Another silently sank beneath the water, leaving only a spreading red cloud behind. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughterhouse. The beach was 300 meters, about 330 yards of open, bullet-swept space. There was no cover except for the anti-tank hedgehogs, behind which already lay the bodies of those who had landed minutes before. Thorne, Miller, Pops Callahan, and a few others made it to the water's edge and fell onto the wet sand, trying to press themselves into it to become invisible. Kid Davis was crawling nearby, his face white with terror. He had lost his rifle somewhere in the water. Doc Peterson, despite the fire, was already trying to help a wounded man, but he died right in his arms. Thorne raised his head and looked at the source of this deadly fire. There, on top of the bluff, in a concrete nest, was the Pillbox. Widerstandsnest 62. Its embrasure was like a merciless, all-seeing eye that spewed death. And Thorne understood one simple, terrifying thing. They couldn't advance. They couldn't retreat. They would all die here, on this damn patch of sand, if they didn't silence that machine gun. There was no communication. The officers were dead. The plan had failed. All that was left was the instinct for survival. He saw Miller trying to shoot back, but his bullets bounced helplessly off the thick concrete. It was suicide. Something had to be done. Something impossible. He looked at his men. Of the 29 who had landed with him, he could see no more than 10 alive, and they were scattered, pinned to the ground, paralyzed by the fire. In his head, through the din and the fear, a mad, desperate idea began to form. If they couldn't go around it, couldn't destroy it from a distance, then there was only one thing left to do. Go straight for it. He crawled over to Miller. "Miller, get everyone who can still move. We need to break for that gully on the left." "It's the only dead space." Miller looked at him like he was insane. "Are you crazy, Sergeant? We'll all be cut down." "We'll all be cut down anyway if we stay here," Thorne snarled. "This is our only chance." "Cover me!" And without waiting for an answer, he jumped to his feet and ran, stooping low. Those were the longest seconds of his life. He expected a bullet in the back, but he kept running. A few men followed him. He heard more screams behind him. He didn't look back. He fell into a small gully that started at the base of the bluff and slid down. He was alive. 4 others joined him. Miller, Pops Callahan, Kid Davis, and Doc Peterson. Just 5. 5 out of an entire platoon. They lay at the bottom of the gully, breathing heavily, listening as bullets continued to whistle over their heads. They were safe. For a few minutes. Thorne looked up along the gully. It led directly to the base of the pillbox. He looked at his terrified, exhausted men, then at the concrete monster above. And in that moment, he knew. If they wanted to survive, he had to become more than just their commander. He had to lead them into the very heart of hell. "Listen to me," he said, his voice as hard as steel. "We're taking that goddamn box." The first few hours inside the captured pillbox were like a fever dream. The adrenaline that had driven them forward during the assault began to recede, giving way to a dull, aching pain, exhaustion, and shock. They had done it. They had achieved the impossible. 5 men against a machine gun nest. They had lost 2 more on the way up, but they had made it. They had tossed grenades into the embrasure, stormed inside, and finished the job in a short, furious, hand-to-hand fight. Now the pillbox was theirs. But the euphoria of victory passed almost instantly, replaced by a cold awareness of reality. Looking down at the beach through the embrasure, Thorne saw that nothing had changed. The landing was still underway, and it was still a slaughter. Their small victory was just a drop in a bloody ocean. And then they found the door. Or rather, what was left of it. During the assault, one of their own grenades or a stray German shell had caused a collapse of rock and concrete at the entrance. The steel blast door had been torn from its hinges and forced inward, and the passage was blocked by tons of earth and stone. They were trapped. God damn it! Miller kicked the blockage, only to cry out in pain. We're buried alive. Panic began to creep in, cold and clammy. The air in the bunker was stale, heavy. It smelled of blood, both theirs and the Germans, gunpowder, and the ozone from the explosions. The walls seemed to press in from all sides. Kid Davis sat on the floor, head in his hands, rocking back and forth. His leg wound, hastily bandaged by Doc, was still bleeding. Pops Callahan walked silently around the small space, his face like stone. Thorne knew that if he let fear take hold now, it was all over. He had to take control. Quiet! His voice was as sharp as a gunshot. Everyone fell silent and looked at him. We're alive. That's what matters. Now we need to figure out what we have. He began the first inventory of their new home and prison. The pillbox was a standard Regelbau H-667 type structure. One main room, the combat casemate, with an embrasure for the machine gun, and a small adjoining room for rest and ammunition storage. The inside was Spartan but functional. 2 bunk beds, a small table, a few crates, and weapons. The main prize was the MG-42, mounted on a tripod in the embrasure. Beside it lay several spare barrels and dozens of metal boxes packed with ammunition belts. Thousands, tens of thousands of rounds. They also found 4 Kar 98K carbines, several crates of style hand grenade stick grenades, and 2 Luger pistols. Their own ammunition was almost gone. Food and water were much scarcer. They found a few cans of German preserves, some kind of ersatz bread that was as hard as a rock, and most importantly, a 20-liter jerry can of water. The water was stale, with a metallic taste, but it was water. Doc Peterson immediately took control of it. Drink only on my command, he said. 1 sip per hour. Otherwise, we won't last 2 days. He examined the kid's wound. A piece of shrapnel had gone deep, but it seemed to have missed the bone. I need to boil some water to clean the wound, he told Thorne, or he'll get an infection. The problem was that starting a fire in a sealed concrete room was suicidal. They would simply suffocate. Thorne established rules. Iron laws for their small world, not to be debated. First, all-around defense. The embrasure faced the beach, but there were also small observation slits in the walls pointing inland. They had to watch both sides constantly. Second, strict conservation of everything. Food, water, medical supplies. Third, no panic. Anyone who gave in to hysteria would be brought to their senses immediately, by any means necessary. Miller listened to him with a wry smile. Defense Sergeant? Who are we defending against? Our own guys when they finally break through? Or the Germans who are about to regroup and just toss grenades in here like we're rats in a hole? We'll defend ourselves against anyone who tries to kill us, Miller, Thorne answered calmly. And yes, the Germans will come. They won't leave their pillbox in our hands. And when they come, we'll be ready for them. We have their machine gun and their ammunition. We'll make them pay for every inch of this ground. The first hours of waiting were the most agonizing. The silence, broken only by the kids' moans and the distant rumble of battle, frayed their nerves. Every rustle outside made them jump. They sat in the dark, conserving the light of a single dim flashlight, and listened. The enemy was everywhere. Outside and inside their own heads. Toward evening, they heard what they had been waiting for. German voices, very close. Thorne pressed his eye to an observation slit. He saw 3 of them. German soldiers, clearly a reconnaissance patrol, were cautiously approaching the pillbox. They didn't know it had been captured. They thought it had just gone silent. Thorne motioned for the others to take positions. His heart was pounding in his chest. This was the first test, their first battle as defenders of this fortress. They waited until the Germans were almost on top of them. The tension was nearly unbearable. But just at that moment, when everything seemed ready for the fight, Kid Davis, lying in the corner, began to twitch with fever and moaned loudly. The sound wasn't loud, but in the ensuing silence, it rang out like an alarm bell. The Germans outside froze. They had heard. And then Doc Peterson, the man who hated violence, did something that was both an act of salvation and of madness. He realized they needed something more than just bullets and water to survive. They needed a weapon they didn't have. The German soldiers froze, exchanging glances. One of them shouted something in German, his voice tense, questioning. Inside the pillbox, an icy silence fell. All eyes were fixed on Doc Peterson, who was still kneeling beside Kid Davis. The kid moaned again, quieter this time, but to those outside, any sound from the silent bunker was an alarm. Thorne had already raised a captured carbine, ready to fire through an observation slit. Miller gripped the handles of the MG-42, but Doc raised a hand, his gesture commanding and unexpected. "Don't shoot," he whispered. "Give me a second." Thorne hesitated. Any delay could cost them their lives, but there was something in Doc's eyes that made the sergeant obey. It wasn't panic, but cold, clear calculation. Doc leaned close to the kid's ear. "Son," his whisper was barely audible, "I need you to scream now. Scream in German. Scream the word Hilfe. Got it? It means help. Scream like you're dying." The kid looked at him with fever-clouded eyes, not understanding. "What? Why?" "Just do as I say. It's our only chance." And without waiting for an answer, Doc pressed down hard on the edges of the boy's wound. The kid howled in pain, his cry shrill and desperate. And through that cry, yielding to instinct and Doc's command, he gasped, "Hilfe, meine Gute, Hilfe." Voices were heard outside again. Closer this time, less wary. The Germans had apparently concluded that their own wounded comrades were inside, survivors of the assault. Their guard was down. This was what Doc had been aiming for. He hadn't used a weapon. He'd used psychology. He had turned their weakness, a wounded comrade, into his greatest weapon. "Fire!" Thorne commanded when he saw through the slit that the Germans had reached the blocked entrance and were trying to move the rocks. Miller squeezed the MG-42's trigger, but he didn't fire at the Germans. He fired to the side, along the slope of the hill, creating a wall of fire and a diversion. At the same instant, Thorne and Pops Callahan opened aimed fire with their carbines through the side slits. The effect was devastating. The Germans, caught by surprise, were trapped in a crossfire. 2 fell immediately. The third, wounded, tried to crawl away, but Pops Callahan, the old hunter, finished him with a single, precise shot. It was over in seconds. Inside the pillbox, silence reigned once more, broken only by heavy breathing and the faint ringing in their ears from the gunfire. They had repelled the first attack, a half-hearted, probing attack, but they had repelled it. And not thanks to firepower, but to Doc's cunning. Miller looked at the medic with a new, unreadable expression. The cynicism in his eyes had been replaced by something like astonishment. "Well, I'll be damned, Doc. Using the kid as bait? That's cold. But it worked." Doc Peterson wiped the sweat from his brow. His hands were trembling slightly. "War isn't surgery, Corporal. Sometimes you have to cause pain to save a life." This small victory, their first in this new war, had a huge psychological impact. It gave them a fragile, barely perceptible hope. They weren't just sitting and waiting to die. They could fight. They could think. They could win. Pops Callahan walked over to Doc and silently offered him his canteen. "You earned this, Doc. That was, something else." Doc took a small sip. The water was warm and foul, but right now it tasted like ambrosia. He looked at the kid, who lay unconscious, exhausted by pain and fever. He had used him, and it made him sick to his stomach. But he saw the bodies of the German soldiers outside and knew they'd had no other choice. Thorne watched the scene. He realized that another leader had emerged in their small group, an informal one, a quiet ally, Doc Peterson, a man whose weapons were not bullets but a knowledge of the human body and mind. And that weapon had proven to be no less deadly than the MG-42. But this victory had a downside. Now the Germans knew for sure that the pillbox hadn't just gone silent. It was occupied. And the next attack wouldn't be a probe. It would be for real. They had fought off the first wave. But they didn't know that with their success, they had drawn attention to themselves. They were no longer just a forgotten group of survivors. They were a problem. And the German command was about to solve it. As twilight fell, looking through the embrasure at the distant flashes on the beach, Thorne understood that their first victory had not brought them salvation. It had only postponed the inevitable, and perhaps made their end even more brutal. The victory over the German patrol changed the atmosphere inside the pillbox. The fear didn't disappear, but something new was mixed in with it. A grim resolve. They were no longer victims awaiting their fate. They were the garrison of a fortress, albeit one consisting of only 5 men. Inspired by their success, Sergeant Thorne began to systematize their survival. He turned chaos into order, creating his own small, harsh state within the concrete walls. "We can't just sit and wait," he announced, gathering them around the dim glow of the flashlight. "We have to act as if help is never coming. From this moment on, we live by the book. Our book." First, he organized a system of watches. 2 hours on duty, 4 hours of rest. One man constantly at the main embrasure, watching the beach and the approaches from the front, another at the side observation slits, monitoring the rear. Sleeping was only allowed in shifts. No one was to sleep at the same time. Pops Callahan, with his experience and calm demeanor, was put in charge of observation. His sharp eye could spot any movement where others would see nothing. Doc Peterson was responsible for rations and the group's medical condition. He divided their meager supplies of food and water into tiny portions, calculated to last for several days. Each man received his share at a strictly appointed time. He continued to care for the kid, whose condition remained grave. The fever wouldn't break, and the boy was often delirious, talking to his girlfriend from Ohio. These quiet, rambling murmurs in the oppressive silence of the pillbox were more unnerving than the roar of battle. Miller, as the strongest man after Thorne and the best machine gunner, was put in charge of the main weapon, the MG-42. He took to the task with unexpected zeal. He disassembled, cleaned, and oiled every mechanism of the German machine gun. With the pedantry of an accountant, he recounted all the ammunition belts, arranging them so they could be reached at a moment's notice. For Miller, that piece of deadly metal became the center of his universe. It gave him purpose, the illusion of control over the situation. Thorne himself took on overall command and the most thankless job, maintaining discipline and morale, which was evaporating with every passing hour. He made them move the bodies of the dead Germans left inside after the assault, piling them in a far corner and covering them with a tarp. He instituted a rule: no idle chatter, no talking about the past, no what-ifs, only what was happening here and now. Their life became a harsh, monotonous ritual. Observation, weapon cleaning, Amiga meal, anxious sleep. The pillbox became their world, their Noah's Ark in the midst of a flood. They had created their own civilization from the wreckage of the old one. And this system, this routine, strangely enough, worked. It gave them a psychological anchor, preventing them from sliding into the madness of despair. They even made a small engineering discovery. Doc, concerned about the lack of sterile water to clean the kid's wound, figured out a way to get it. They found a few metal pots among the German supplies. Using a lens from a pair of binoculars and the rare rays of sun that broke through the smoke, they managed to heat water to a boil. It was a long, painstaking process, but it yielded them a few hundred grams of clean water a day. It was another small victory of intellect over circumstance. On the second day, the Germans made another attempt to retake the pillbox. This time, they were smarter. The attack began at dawn. First, a sniper opened up on the embrasure. Bullets chipped at the concrete, ricocheting with a nasty whine. Then, under the cover of sniper fire, an assault group of 5 men began to advance from the rear, using the folds in the terrain. But Pops Callahan spotted them. He didn't say a word, just poked Thorne in the side and pointed. Thorne gave the order. They didn't wait. Miller swiveled the MG-42, aiming it not through the embrasure, but into the doorway that faced the interior of the pillbox, and opened fire on the attackers through the gaps in the collapsed entrance. The roar of the bone cutter in the enclosed space was deafening. It hammered at their eardrums, made the very air vibrate. Shell casings rained down on the concrete floor. The Germans, not expecting fire from that direction, were swept away by a hurricane of lead. The attack was crushed before it could even begin. They had won again. Inside the pillbox, after the machine gun fell silent, the air was filled with acrid gunpowder smoke and a ringing in their ears. Miller patted the hot barrel shroud. For the first time in a long while, a shadow of a smile appeared on his face. "Now, this is a machine," he rasped. "A real meat grinder." They felt invincible. They had created a system. They had learned to fight in their fortress. They had repelled the enemy twice. Their life had fallen into a harsh but predictable rhythm. But not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of this new world. Miller, intoxicated by his success and the power of the machine gun, began to change. A dangerous glint appeared in his eyes. He started looking at Thorne not as a commander, but as an equal, or even as a rival. In the darkness of their concrete world, a mutiny began to brew. The relative calm that followed the repulsion of the second attack was deceptive. It was like the eye of a hurricane. The external threat had temporarily receded, but within their small world, a tension began to grow, thick and poisonous as swamp gas. And the epicenter of this tension was becoming Corporal Miller. Victory had changed him. The power over the MG-42, that monstrous engine of destruction, had intoxicated him. He, who had been a nobody his whole life, a pawn in someone else's game, suddenly felt like the master of the situation. He was the one who made the enemy writhe in the dust. He was a god of death in their small concrete paradise, and this newfound status began to clash with the iron discipline established by Sergeant Thorne. It started with small things. Miller began to question orders. At first, under his breath, with his characteristic cynicism. "Why save water, Sergeant? We can make a sortie at night and get more." "The Germans have plenty." Thorne patiently explained that any sortie was a suicide risk. They didn't know where the enemy posts were, where the minefields were. "We sit here and we wait." "That's an order." Miller would fall silent, but disagreement lingered in his eyes. Then he started breaking the routine. During his watch at the machine gun, he might doze off, confident the Germans wouldn't dare attack again so soon. Thorne found him asleep and without a word poured a cup of precious cold water over his head. Miller jumped up, cursing furiously. "What the hell, Thorne? You were sleeping on your post, Corporal. Next time I won't wake you." "The Germans will do it for me." The conflict smoldered like a peat fire ready to erupt at any moment. Pops Callahan and Doc Peterson saw it and remained silent, taking a wait-and-see position. They understood Thorne was right, but they also saw that Miller wasn't a villain. He was a man pushed to his limit, looking for a simple and quick way out of a hopeless situation. He was the voice of their shared desperation. The breaking point was the incident with Kid Davis. The boy was getting worse. The wound was infected. The fever wouldn't go down. He tossed and turned in a delirium, and Doc said that without proper antibiotics and surgery, he had little chance. And then Miller exploded. "So we're just going to sit here and watch him die?" he screamed, jumping to his feet. His face was contorted with anger and fear. "Our guys are down there on the beach now. I saw them. We have to signal them." "Fire a flare!" There was indeed a flare gun in the German arsenal, but Thorne had forbidden its use. "If we fire a flare, it won't just be our guys who see it, but the Germans too. They'll know we're still here and that we're desperate. They'll launch a massive assault, or they'll just call in artillery and level this pillbox with us inside. We can't take that risk." "Risk?" Miller laughed, a hysterical sound. "We're already risking everything. We're risking rotting in here alive. I'm not going to die in this hole just because our sergeant is afraid to make a decision. If you won't do it, I will." He stepped toward the crate where the flare gun lay. Thorne blocked his path. His face was calm, but his eyes were as cold as ice. "Step aside, Miller." "No, Thorne. I've had enough of your command. You're leading us to our deaths." It was mutiny, open and direct. An unbearable tension hung in the small enclosed space of the pillbox. Pops and Doc froze, knowing something irreparable was about to happen. Miller tried to push Thorne aside, and then the sergeant struck. A short, precise blow, honed by years of training, a rifle butt to the solar plexus. Miller doubled over, gasping for air. A second blow, with the pistol gripped to the back of his head, sent him to the floor. He lay unconscious. Thorne stood over him, breathing heavily. There was no anger or triumph on his face, only infinite weariness. He looked at Doc and Pops. "Tie him up." Doc hesitated. "Sergeant, maybe we shouldn't—" "I said tie him up." Thorne's voice was steel. "He's a threat to all of us. When he comes to, we'll talk. Until then, he's under arrest." It was a form of surgical cruelty. Thorne had amputated the gangrenous part of their small organism to save the whole. He had sacrificed the trust of one man to preserve the lives of all. He had become a tyrant so they might have a chance at salvation. He had upheld his law. The mutiny was crushed. But while they were dealing with each other, they failed to notice that their real enemy was preparing its final, devastating blow. Pops Callahan, who had been at the observation slit this whole time, suddenly said quietly, "Sergeant, I think we have company. And this time there are a lot of them." Thorne went to the slit and looked out. His heart sank. In the pre-dawn mist, he saw a large assault group moving toward the pillbox. At least 20 men. And among them were 2 who were carrying something bulky and ominous on their backs. Flamethrowers. The realization hit instantly, like a punch to the gut. This was the end. Against a flamethrower in an enclosed concrete space, they didn't stand a chance. The pillbox, their fortress and sanctuary, was about to become an oven, a crematorium. Thorne looked at his men. At Pops Callahan, whose face was as calm as a man who had already made peace with his fate. At Doc Peterson, who, despite everything, continued to moisten the lips of the unconscious kid. He looked at the bound Miller, who had regained consciousness and was now staring at him with a mixture of hatred and terror in his eyes. In that moment, there was no commander, no mutineer. There were only 4 living men and 1 dying one trapped, awaiting a horrific death. "Untie him," Thorne said quietly, nodding at Miller. Doc looked at him surprised. "Sergeant?" "Untie him," Thorne repeated. "If we're gonna die, we'll die as soldiers. All of us. We'll need every gun." Doc cut the ropes. Miller slowly got up, rubbing his wrists. He didn't say a word. He just walked over to the MG-42 and took his place. A silent reconciliation in the face of death. The Germans were in no hurry. They acted methodically, professionally. First, the sniper opened up on the embrasure again, forcing them to hug the walls. Then the machine guns started, peppering the pillbox with lead from several directions, keeping them from peeking out. And then the mortar barrage began. Shells landed all around the pillbox, the explosions shaking the ground, the concrete walls trembling, dust raining from the ceiling. Each blast resonated in their chests, knocking the wind out of their lungs. The noise was unimaginable. Kid Davis cried out in his sleep and then fell silent forever. Doc leaned over him, checked his pulse, and silently shook his head. His death, quiet and unnoticed in the midst of this hell, was the final straw. Rage, cold and pure, displaced the fear. "Miller!" Thorne yelled, trying to be heard over the din. "Give it to them! Give them everything we've got!" And Miller did. He gripped the handles of the bone cutter and squeezed the trigger. He fired without aiming, just sweeping the barrel from side to side, unleashing a wall of fire into the pre-dawn mist. Thorne and Pops supported him with carbine fire through the side slits. They fought back like rabid animals cornered in a cage. They knew it was pointless, but they couldn't do otherwise. They would make the enemy pay for their lives. Under the cover of this fire, the assault teams with the flamethrowers began to close in. They moved in short dashes, from cover to cover. One of them was already 20 meters, about 65 feet away. Thorne could see him through the slit. He saw the nozzle of the flamethrower like the mouth of a serpent. A few more seconds. "Ammo!" Miller rasped. The belt was empty. Pops Callahan, without a word, grabbed a new box and rushed to the machine gun. Reloading the MG-42 took seconds, but now those seconds felt like an eternity. And it was at that exact moment that the flamethrower operator fired. A long orange tongue of flame erupted from the nozzle. The thick, viscous, burning mixture slammed into the concrete next to the embrasure. The pillbox didn't catch fire, but a wave of superheated air and acrid black smoke poured inside. It became impossible to breathe. The temperature instantly skyrocketed. The walls became hot to the touch. They were truly in an oven. Pops Callahan, who was closest to the embrasure, screamed. His clothes were on fire. He rolled on the floor, trying to smother the flames. Doc rushed to him with a blanket. Miller, having reloaded the machine gun, opened fire again, his face a mask of fury and desperation. He saturated the spot where he had seen the flamethrower operator with lead. The second operator began to approach from the other side. Thorne knew this was their death agony. They were doomed. He grabbed the last grenade. He wasn't going to burn alive. But at the very moment he was about to pull the pin, he heard a new sound through the roar of battle. A low, rumbling, clanking sound. The sound he had waited for and had given up on ever hearing. The sound of tank treads. And these weren't German tanks. He pressed his face to the embrasure, burning himself on the hot concrete. And he saw it. Down on the beach, having finally broken through the defenses, Shermans were moving across the sand. American infantry ran behind them. The main force had broken through. Suddenly, a tank cannon fired at the German positions on the bluff. Then another. The Germans assaulting the pillbox were caught between a rock and a hard place. They broke off the attack and began to retreat under the fire of their own enemies. Miller kept firing into their backs until the last belt ran dry, and then everything went quiet. Inside the pillbox, there was silence, broken only by the crackling of the burning clothes on Pops Callahan's body, and the hoarse coughing of the others as they choked on the smoke. They were alive, burned, concussed, almost unconscious, but alive. Thorne lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling. He felt nothing. He just watched as the first ray of morning sun pierced through the smoke in the embrasure. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a cry of astonishment. They had survived. The euphoria of rescue was short-lived, almost fleeting. It dissolved in the acrid smoke that filled their concrete prison. The first to reach them were the combat engineers. They heard a tapping from outside, not hostile but methodical, deliberate. Then came muffled voices in English. Thorne, gathering his last strength, rasped, "We're in here! Rangers, we're friendly!" Half an hour later, which felt like an eternity, the blockage was partially cleared. Fresh, salty air and bright daylight flooded into the opening, blinding them. The silhouette of a soldier appeared in the gap. He peered inside, and for a moment his face froze in astonishment. The scene before him was worthy of a surrealist painting. In a dark, soot-blackened concrete tomb, amid spent shell casings and bodies in German uniforms, lay 3 living figures, black with grime, in the burnt rags of American uniforms. One of them, a medic, was trying to aid a fourth, who was horribly burned and moaning softly. A fifth lay in a corner, covered by a blanket. They were pulled out into the light of day. After the gloom of the pillbox, the bright sun seared their eyes. The world outside was deafeningly loud, alive, filled with shouts, the roar of engines and commands. The beach was still littered with equipment and bodies, but now hundreds, thousands of American soldiers were moving across it. The war had moved on, deeper into the coast. Their survival, their titanic struggle, had been just a tiny, unnoticed episode in the giant panorama of D-Day. They were surrounded by curious onlookers. A young, clean-shaven lieutenant with a notepad approached them. His uniform was almost spotless. He looked at them with a kind of squeamish curiosity, as if they were strange beasts. "Who are you?" he asked, wrinkling his nose at the smell of smoke and death that clung to them. "What unit?" Thorne tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. "Sergeant Elias Thorne, 2nd Ranger Battalion, Charlie Company." "This," he nodded at the others, "is Corporal Miller, Corporal Peterson. Private Callahan is severely wounded." The lieutenant jotted something down. "Charlie Company?" "According to my records, Charlie Company was almost completely wiped out during the landing. Are you deserters?" Blood rushed to Thorne's face. He wanted to jump up and hit this headquarters puppy, but he didn't have the strength. Miller, lying nearby, just laughed. A quiet, hoarse, insane laugh. "Deserters?" he wheezed. "Kid, we just spent 2 days in a hell you've only seen in the movies. We took this pillbox, the 3 of us." "Well, the 5 of us." The lieutenant looked incredulously at the pillbox, then back at them. "You took this pillbox, the 5 of you? Don't be ridiculous. This position was suppressed by tank artillery. You were just found here." "Lucky." In that moment, Thorne understood everything. He understood the monstrous irony of their rescue, their feat, their sacrifices, their superhuman efforts. None of it mattered. It wasn't in the reports. It didn't fit the picture of a victorious breakthrough. They were a statistical anomaly, an inconvenient truth that was easier to ignore. No one listened to their story. They were sent to a rear area hospital. Pops Callahan, who had suffered terrible burns, was evacuated to England. They would never see him again. The 3 of them, Thorne, Miller, and Doc, faced a board of inquiry after a brief recovery. They sat in a clean, bright office in front of 3 officers who looked at them with cold, appraising eyes. Thorne told them everything. About the landing, the assault on the pillbox, the blocked exit, the defense, the flamethrowers. He spoke calmly, without emotion, as if telling someone else's story. The officers listened, occasionally making notes. They didn't ask any questions. When he finished, the senior officer, a major with tired eyes, looked at him and said, "Sergeant, your story sounds incredible. To capture a pillbox with 5 men, hold it for almost 2 days, repel several attacks. It sounds like a Hollywood movie script." "It's not a movie, sir. It's what happened," Thorne replied quietly. The major sighed. "Listen, men. Officially, Resistance Nest WN-62 was neutralized by naval gunfire and tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion. You probably took shelter there during the fighting. We appreciate your courage, but taking credit for others' achievements is not advisable. War is a team effort. They were crushed, not by bullets, not by flamethrowers, but by bureaucracy, by indifference, by a system that did not tolerate anomalies. Their feat was too great and too small scale to be believed. It violated the order of things. The system's verdict was the final, cruelest blow. Their brotherhood, forged in a concrete hell, was destroyed. Their heroism was buried alive under stacks of headquarters paperwork. They were judged not as heroes, but at best, as shell-shocked soldiers whose testimony was unreliable. They were handed their sentence. Due to the loss of their unit and psychological trauma, recommend transfer to different units for continued service, and they were being separated. Fate, which had spared their lives in the concrete hell of Omaha Beach, proved far less merciful in the world they had fought to protect. Their small squad, their brotherhood sealed in blood and gunpowder, was disbanded with the stroke of a pen by a soulless staff clerk. Their paths diverged forever, and each of them continued to live out his own personal war. Sergeant Elias Thorne, as an experienced NCO, was not discharged. He was transferred to a training unit in England. The man who had led an assault group through an inferno and held a fortress against all odds was now tasked with teaching recruits how to march and clean their rifles. He tried to tell them about the real war, about how no plan survives the first 5 minutes of combat, about how the most important thing is to watch out for the man next to you. But the greenhorns looked at him like he was crazy. They considered his stories about defending the Pillbox to be war stories, a soldier's tall tales. He stopped trying. He just did his job, mechanically, with dead eyes. In the evenings, he would sit in a pub and drink in silence. He died in 1953 from cirrhosis of the liver. There was not a single mention in his service record of the 2 days spent in Widerstandsnest 62. Corporal Miller, whose rage and lust for life had burned so brightly within the walls of the Pillbox, could not find his place in the orderly life of the army. His cynicism, which had once been his armor, turned into a poison that corrupted everything around him. He was transferred to a regular infantry company. He constantly argued with his superiors, violated discipline, and looked for fights. He was demoted to private. During the Ardennes offensive in a snow-covered forest near Bastogne, he was killed. A stray piece of shrapnel from a mortar shell killed him as he was charging the enemy. A stupid, senseless death for a man who had survived in the very heart of hell. It was said that in his final moment, he didn't scream. He laughed. Doc Peterson, the corporal whose weapons were a scalpel and his intellect, was the only one who seemed to be able to return to a normal life. He was medically discharged, a persistent cough from smoke inhalation and nervous exhaustion. He went back to his hometown in Pennsylvania, finished medical school, and became a doctor. He was a good doctor, attentive, compassionate. He saved hundreds of lives. But every night he had the same nightmare. A cramped concrete pillbox, the moans of Kid Davis, and the face of Pops Callahan engulfed in flames. He never told anyone what happened on Omaha Beach, not even his wife. His secret died with him in 1982 from a heart attack. For a long time, nothing was known about the fate of Private Pops Callahan. Thorne tried to make inquiries through the Red Cross, but to no avail. It was only many years later, after the war, that a short entry surfaced in a hospital archive. Private Percival Callahan, severe burns, over 60% of his body, died of his wounds 3 weeks after evacuation in a hospital in Cardiff, Wales. He never regained consciousness. Private Kid Davis, the 19-year-old boy from Ohio, remained there, in the corner of the German pillbox. His body, along with the bodies of the slain Germans, was carried out and buried in a mass grave. His girlfriend received a standard notification, killed in action while bravely serving his country. She would never know that her fiancé had not died in battle, but from a fever, in a concrete tomb hundreds of miles from home, deliriously whispering her name. And so ended the story of the 5 Rangers who captured an enemy fortress and became its prisoners. The official history of the war did not notice them. Their names dissolved among millions of others. Their feat was erased, like an unnecessary note in the margins of a staff map. He was buried in an old cemetery in a small American town. But as the locals told it, strange things would sometimes appear on his grave, on Sergeant Thorne's grave. A smooth sea stone or an empty rusted shell casing from a German bullet. No one knew who brought them. The official chronicles of World War II are a majestic, monumental tapestry woven from maps, orders, casualty reports, and victory communiques. On this tapestry, there is room for great battles, for the names of generals and the designations of armies. But there is almost no room left for the small, quiet tragedies and incredible feats that never made it into the reports. The story of the garrison of Pillbox WN62 is one of them. It was not recorded. It is not studied in military academies. It did not become part of the official myth, but it did not vanish without a trace. It survived. It became a legend. A soldier's tale that veterans of the 743rd Tank Battalion would tell in whispers in bars, washing down their memories with beer. They spoke of the ghost bunker on Omaha Beach, of a strange machine gun nest that, in the heat of battle, suddenly began firing not at the Americans but at the Germans, helping them break through. It was said that when the tankers finally reached it, they found only the bodies of dead Germans and the hot, smoking barrel of an MG-42. Not a single living American. Among the Rangers who assaulted neighboring sectors, another belief took hold. They said that the souls of their fallen comrades from Charlie Company never left the beach, that they had possessed that pillbox and continued their war even after death, avenging their own lost lives. This story was passed from mouth to mouth, acquiring new, unbelievable details. It became part of the trench truth, the kind of truth that is more important and more enduring than any archival document, because it speaks not of strategy, but of spirit. It is about the fact that even when the system writes you off, when you are left alone against the world, locked in hell, the human will is capable of miracles. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? Was surviving hell worth being forgotten and crushed by the world you fought for? There is no answer to that question. But their story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten feat. It is a reminder that the greatest battles are sometimes fought in the smallest and darkest of places. In the cramped cabin of a disabled tank, in the flooded compartment of a submarine, or within the walls of a cold concrete pillbox on the coast of Normandy. And victory in these battles is not measured in captured territory, but in one more day lived, one more breath, one more piece of humanity preserved in the midst of the all-consuming madness of war. They received no medals. Their names are not carved on memorials, but their story lives on. It lives on as a legend of the indomitable spirit of soldiers locked inside their greatest prize, of how victory in one battle turned into a desperate fight for survival, where help was nowhere to be found. And in that fight they were victorious.